The good old persecution complex. Why do people who aren't being persecuted or discriminated against like to think that they are? There are clearly groups within our Western society, at least, who have been persecuted and discriminated against for centuries. People of colour, women, Jewish people, people who don't fit our normal expectations regarding gender and sexuality. Part of the reason for this is that human beings like to identify some other, some outgroup that can be targeted as the enemy. These groups are perceived in some way as a threat to our way of life, to our values. This helps to strengthen and unify our own group. Groups that are themselves persecuted don't escape this need to persecute someone else. It's always possible to identify some subgroup, even within your own larger group, to make the target of your hatred. If people of colour have been generally persecuted, it's not been beyond men of colour from oppressing women, for instance. And within this subgroup, perhaps married women target unmarried women, or unmarried mothers anyway. And often groups that were once persecuted can themselves turn into the persecutors. We're always able to find some enemy to target. Putting someone else down, I guess, is supposed to boost our own self-esteem and value. Kind of pathetic, really, isn't it? That the way to make ourselves feel better is to put someone else down. Bullies do that, and bully groups do that. So, when these marginalised groups begin to assert their claims, when they begin to demand the same rights that majority groups enjoy, people in the dominant groups naturally feel threatened. So they will clamp down and fortify their position. And sometimes this works, at least for a while. There are powerful forces trying to reinforce the status quo. But when these marginalised groups do eventually begin to acquire some of the rights that they've been fighting for, the same rights that others have enjoyed for centuries, if not millennia, a strange thing happens. The people in positions of power and privilege begin to claim that they are being persecuted, that they are being oppressed and discriminated against. They adopt the victim persona. I think we're seeing this today, especially within privileged white groups, especially among white males. Also Christian groups, and especially white male Christians. They are now trying to identify themselves as a marginalised group. This is certainly one of the things that the right in the USA, and particularly Trump and his followers, are trying to encourage, this sense of being persecuted. The threat of others actually gaining the rights and privileges that they have enjoyed for centuries is simply too much for them. There are those on the right who think giving women the right to vote was a mistake and they'd like to take that back. And in a sense, they're right to be afraid, because now they might actually have to yield up some of their power and privilege. If nothing else, they'll have to stop thinking about themselves as in some way special or chosen or superior. Playing the victim is a tactic. In some ways it's a clever tactic, because yes, in some ways they might actually have to surrender some of that privilege and some of that power. Of course, it's about time. Long past time, in fact. But there's another factor that enters in when we're talking about Christians and Christian groups. Christians have the special quality that they actually like the idea of being persecuted. Perhaps in some hidden part of their being, hidden deep within their psyche, they actually feel somewhat guilty that they're not in fact being persecuted. That they're not being given the opportunity to become martyrs to their faith. They're not being given the opportunity to demonstrate the strength of their faith, the strength of their commitment. Evangelical and fundamentalist groups especially are aware of how Christians in the early church were often persecuted. This was part of their identity, even being executed for their beliefs. Being persecuted is built into their psyche. It's built into the model of early Christianity. And particularly among spiritual descendants of separatists, who were early settlers in America, who also perceived themselves as a persecuted group. Being persecuted is seen as an essential part of the Christian life. If you're not being persecuted, maybe that means you're not doing your part as a Christian. Being persecuted is seen as a validation of your faith. So, when you combine the threat posed by other groups who perhaps threaten your position of power and privilege with this inner martyr complex, it's not hard to see how white Christian men, for example, might want to rebrand themselves as victims of persecution and discrimination. And they call us liberals snowflakes.